Well, in the annals of Australian electoral history, the return of the Howard government in 1998 was remarkable. It was hardly remarkable to see the return of a government after one term, nor was it remarkable for the government to be returned after one term with a reduced vote. What was remarkable was the return of a government after one term, notwithstanding that it had secured a smaller proportion than the opposition of the first preference vote and a smaller proportion than the opposition of the two-party preferred. With just 39.2% of the votes, the Liberal and National parties had won fewer first preference votes than Labor with 40.1%. And with just 49%, it had won a smaller share than Labor of the two-party preferred. Not since 1943, when it was hopelessly divided, had the coalition recorded such a low first preference vote. Not since 1946, when Labor had enjoyed its greatest triumph since Federation, would the coalition have registered such a low two-party preferred vote. Not even when it lost office to Whitlam in 72 or Hawke in 83 had the coalition on either measure performed so poorly. According to the electoral pendulum, the coalition's two-party preferred should have seen it lose 30 seats net, leaving it 6 seats short of a majority. In the event, it lost 18, leaving it with 12 more than the combined total for Labor and the re-elected member for Calare, Peter Andren. Never had there been a greater mismatch between the number of seats the pendulum said should go to the coalition and the number that did go. With one exception, Page in New South Wales, the seats that defied the pendulum were held by the Liberal Party, not the Nationals. Today I want to focus on 3 aspects of the coalition's performance. First, on how it managed to defy the pendulum and stay in office. Second, on identifying the voters who swung, and third, on the issues that worked for or against the coalition, not only in relation to Labor, but also in relation to One Nation. How can we explain the coalition's performance, more precisely the Liberal Party's performance, in beating the pendulum? One argument is that the pendulum fails to take into account variations by state, but looking at the states does not get us very far. As David Butler observed, Labor lost in 12 seats it would have won if the swing had been uniform nationwide, or in 13 it would have won if the swing had been uniform within each state. John Warhurst has made a similar point. Crucially, every one of the 12 seats the coalition held against the swing was retained by a sitting member, not someone newly pre-selected. In his analysis of the 2004 election, Simon Jackman shows that incumbents in coalition seats, but not Labor seats, benefited from incumbency. This, he suggested, was a function of the coalition being in government. But if being a sitting member on the government benches was a necessary condition for defying the swing, it was not a sufficient one. Of the 19 seats the coalition lost in 1998, no fewer than 13 were held by incumbents. Those that held on were not just incumbents, they were what Jackman, an Australian academic working in the United States at the time, called sophomores, elected in 2001 and facing their first re-election in 2004. For Liberal sophomores, the value of the bonus in 2004 was about 2 percentage points on Simon's calculation. For National Party sophomores, it was around 2.8 percentage points. If the same were true in 1998, the sophomore surge would have been enough to save no fewer than 7 seats for the coalition: Parramatta, Lindsay, Robertson and Page in New South Wales, McEwen and Deakin in Victoria, and Macon in South Australia. In addition, in some of the coalition's closest contests, 3 of its candidates secured the top spot on the ballot, the donkey vote. The mean value of the donkey vote is widely estimated to be about 1 percentage point. The seats the coalition retained by this piece of luck were Eden Monero, Hinkler and probably Parramatta, though there Ross Cameron might have been saved as well by his status as a sophomore. Was the coalition's success in winning a disproportionate share of the sophomore seats a sign of superior campaigning? not if the first preference vote is any measure. In every state and territory, the Coalition's first preference vote fell. In New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland and Western Australia, the Coalition's vote was lower than at any election since 1977. Nor is the Liberals' superiority as campaigners evident if we look at the two-party preferred. In the Coalition's marginals, its two-party preferred slipped from 52.8% to 49.5%. In Labor's marginals, it slid from 48.5% to 42.2%. We need to debunk the myth, wrote Gary Gray, Labor's Federal Secretary after the election, that the Coalition out-campaigned us in marginal seats. What beat us, he said, in these seats was incumbency and blatant and unprecedented pork barrelling. Pork barrelling, something governments can do but not oppositions, might explain why the incumbency advantage was enjoyed only by those on the government side. Would its disbursement explain why some sophomores survived while others didn't? We don't know. What the pork was, where it was rolled out, and exactly what difference it made are questions that remain to be answered. What about the sort of voters who swung? According to John Black, the former Labor senator, now CEO of a company specialising in matching aggregate votes in census divisions to the demographic characteristics of these divisions, Labor's anti-GST campaign appealed to voters in safe ALP urban seats where the swings were completely wasted, not to the marginal coalition seats that Labor needed to win. Writing in The Australian, where one might have hoped for better, Black argued that Labor lost because the biggest swings to Labor came from its safer seats containing large numbers of tradesmen and semi-skilled and unskilled blue-collar workers, and from seats dominated by voters aged 55 and above with lower workplace participation rates, who lived in non-urban, national and Liberal seats. For Black, what was paramount was that the biggest swings to Labor came in lower income seats, and these tended to be safe ALP seats or safe coalition seats. By contrast, he says, the biggest swing against Labor came from the aspirational occupational group of paraprofessionals in the marginal coalition urban seats. Black's account is misleading in pretty well every possible way. First, Labor's safe seats, almost all of them in New South Wales, where there were 17 and Victoria 13, recorded swings above the average for their state, no more often than they recorded swings at or below the average. Second, Black's work ignores what is known as the ecological fallacy. Invalidly, it infers the views of individuals from the behaviour of aggregates. While the biggest swings to Labor might have occurred in census districts with disproportionately large numbers of blue-collar workers, it doesn't follow that blue-collar workers were the voters most likely to have swung. To see which voters were most likely to have swung requires access to the sorts of individual level data generated by surveys, not the aggregate data provided by the census. Third, even if Black's analysis properly identified the kinds of voters who had swung, it would not tell us why these voters had swung. Reviewing Labor's performance, Candy Broad, the party's assistant secretary, drawing no doubt on the party's interview research, singled out Labor's success, quote, in rebuilding support among pensioners, people on low incomes, people who identify themselves as working class, and women voters. One of these groups, people on low income, coincides with a group that Black identified. Others, pensioners, and people who identify themselves as working class, are largely subsets of groups Black identified. The last, women voters, is a group Black ignores. Was Broad right? In their analysis of the Australian election study conducted after the election, Ian McAllister and Clive Bean found no evidence that Labor's appeals to voters over 65 met with any success. Labor, however, did appear to have done marginally better among respondents identifying as working class. And although Broad is probably right in suggesting that Labor narrowed the gender gap, this may have had less to do with Labor's efforts to attract women than with one nation's success in attracting men. What about the other groups Black singled out? On the evidence provided by the Australian election study, the biggest swings towards Labor did indeed come from blue-collar workers. But the shift was almost entirely due to the shift to Labor among the self-employed, the voters who in 1996 had swung disproportionately to Howard. The biggest swing against Labor appears to have come from professional workers generally, not just, as Black surmised, from paraprofessionals in the marginal coalition urban seats. The biggest swings against the coalition were nearly twice as big and more widely based, with support for the coalition dropping by 9 percentage points among blue-collar workers and by 8 percentage points among white-collar workers. But thanks to One Nation, a factor Black's two-party preferred analysis necessarily ignores, the coalition's loss of blue-collar workers was almost twice as big as Labor's gain. Among blue-collar workers who were self-employed, the coalition's support fell by 26 percentage points. Among those who are not self-employed, it fell by just 2 percentage points. Moreover, the coalition lost almost as many white-collar votes to One Nation as it lost blue-collar votes. Labor, whose white-collar support was essentially unchanged, didn't. The issues most frequently associated with the election, and not just by Black, was of course the GST. But if the 1998 election was a referendum on the GST, it appears to have ended in a tie. As a vote shifter on the evidence of the Australian election study, the GST was statistically insignificant. That Howard displayed uncommon daring in arguing for a GST should go without saying. As Paul Kelly notes, the unpopular GST created the legend of Howard as the leader with the courage of his convictions. But Howard's gamble was shrewd. Liberal Party research in 1997 showed that while voters were still hostile to a GST, they had come to feel it was inevitable. Moreover, Howard believed, based again on Liberal Party polling, that in 1993 it had been the coalition's health policy that had cost it the unlosable election, not the GST. In the 1998 election study, health was not a negative for the coalition, nor was industrial relations or immigration. However, education was a negative, as was privatisation and unemployment. Two issues on which the coalition enjoyed an advantage were interest rates and the general issue of taxation considered without mentioning the GST. The economy was also a plus. The difference in the proportions that thought the economy had improved and that thought it had deteriorated was small, but the coalition enjoyed a clear advantage among those who thought things had improved and suffered no disadvantage among those who thought things had gone backwards. However, those who felt their household finances had gone backwards, like those who felt the economy had gone backwards, moved away from the coalition. What of One Nation? In her maiden speech, Howard says in his autobiography, Hamsun, quote, echoed community sentiment with her attacks on multiculturalism, ATSIC and the separatist policies for black and white Australians, and blanket condemnation of political correctness. Polls at the time, however, showed that support for multiculturalism, they almost always have, showed support for multiculturalism, as they almost always have, though particular forms of multiculturalism or multiculturalism that depended on particular kinds of government support were widely rejected. Similarly, polls showed widespread support for black and white Australians being treated differently, over land rights for example, even as respondents affirmed that Aboriginal and other Australians ought to be treated the same. Hansard could only have echoed community sentiment, as Howard says, by acknowledging difference of these kinds, not by denying them. Hanson's broad appeal, says Howard, was not racist. Rather, quote, she echoes concerns about the pace of change, the pressures that parts of our community are under, and long smouldering resentment about attitudes which have been imposed upon the majority of the Australian community without that majority feeling it has even had an opportunity of debating those issues. But an analysis of the Australian election study suggests the vote for One Nation was not driven by economic insecurity, not by views about their own financial situation or that of the country, nor by respondents' fears about unemployment. In 1998, respondents worried about economic insecurity switched from the coalition to Labor. If Howard or Beazley thought this was the key to winning that One Nation vote, he was mistaken. Instead, the vote for One Nation was associated with three other considerations. One was political dissatisfaction, the sense among respondents that there wasn't much difference between Labor and Liberal, that political parties were doing a bad or very bad job, that the way democracy works in Australia was not satisfactory, the political parties didn't care about ordinary people, the political parties indeed weren't needed in Australia. As political dissatisfaction rose in the survey, support for One Nation also rose, but support rose more steeply for the Australian Democrats than for One Nation. A second association was that with opposition to immigration. Respondents who agreed that the number of immigrants allowed into Australia should be reduced, that immigrants increase the crime rate and take jobs from people who are born in Australia, or respondents who denied that immigrants are generally good for Australia's economy and make Australia more open to new ideas and cultures. The more consistent their anti-immigration sentiment, the lower the predicted probability of voting Labor, voting for the Democrats, or voting for the Coalition, but the higher the probability of voting One Nation. The third association was with attitudes to support for Aborigines, respondents agreeing that land rights or government help for Aborigines had gone too far, or disagreeing that as first Australians, Aborigines should have special cultural protection that other groups don't have, that it's important for the well-being of Australian society the aspirations of Aborigines to be recognised, and that the Constitution should specifically recognise the right of Aborigines to self-government. As anti-Aboriginal sentiment in the survey increased, support for the Coalition increased sharply, while support for both Labor and the Democrats decreased sharply. Support for One Nation also increased, though not as sharply as support for the Coalition, or as sharply as it did on the anti-immigration scale. To conclude, it's conceivable, as Sean Carney claims, that it was thanks in part to Labor's tax credit plan offering too little to the new middle class in the outer suburbs that the government held on to enough of the outer suburban marginals and provincial seats to retain office. Conceivable, but unlikely. Explanations of this kind place too much weight on one section of the electorate, on one issue, and on one side. They ignore the luck of the draw and the government's advantage of having so many candidates elected for the first time in 1996 standing for re-election. The extent to which the Coalition's success in the sophomore seats was the result of its building a firewall, relying, as Crosby puts it, on good MPs, putting more resources into local campaigns, including television advertising, and sorting out what seats we could hold, the efficacy of that is moot. In the absence of some ways of distinguishing good MPs from bad ones, more detail about the resources put into the electorates that were won and lost, and a list of seats the party's extra-parliamentary organisations thought they could hold, the issue must remain moot. Confident that people were voting on the GST as a central issue, Costello declared that victory gave the government a mandate. What if, as the evidence suggests, it wasn't a referendum on the GST? Others argue that a mandate depends not on the government securing support for particular policies, but on its winning a plurality of the first preference vote or the majority of the two-party preferred. But for 1998, that won't cut it. For Crosby, the government had a mandate to reform the tax system simply because it had secured a majority of the seats. If so, it was a mandate Labor rejected. Labor's research was said to have indicated that its initial decision to respect the Coalition's mandate had left the electorate in considerable doubt about whether its opposition to the GST was genuine. Finally, the Hamsun Factor. Most of those who voted for One Nation had voted for the Coalition in 1996. A more vigorous response from me to Hamsun, Howard argues, would have intensified the frustrations felt by those Australians to whom she gave voice and gratuitously alienated them from me. Even if one wished that he had become and been more vigorous, Howard's conclusion is difficult to deny. Howard was keen to attract One Nation's preferences, The seats Howard's sophomores held against the swing were seats in which the One Nation vote mattered. But if only 53% of One Nation voters went on to preference the coalition, as Crosby reports, Howard's approach can't have benefited the Liberals very much. Since 53% of all One Nation voters preferenced the coalition over Labor, the flow of preferences from those who had not voted for the coalition in 1996 must have been much the same as the flow of preferences from those who had. Overall, the preferences of One Nation voters benefited the coalition only marginally. Paul Kelly insists that by not calling Hamsun out, Howard sacrificed both principle and electoral gain. This assumes that Howard's attempts to draw One Nation voters back to the coalition cost the Liberals more votes than it gained. We will never know. What we do know is that on Aboriginal issues, and to a lesser extent on issues of immigration, Howard's willingness to adopt positions closer to Hamsun than to her critics, abolishing ATSIC, revisiting land rights, drawing back from multiculturalism, would have gone down much better among those who voted for the coalition than among those who voted for the Democrats or for Labor. Thank you.
We now have some time for questions. If you'd please raise your hand, we will bring one of the microphones to you. Wait till the microphone arrives. We need it not necessarily because we can't hear your voice, but for the purpose of the recording. You might just mention your name and then put your question. While the microphones are moving around, let me ask then, is it the case that the electorate's becoming more variegated by 1998? Could you make that as a general observation, that people aren't voting as predictably as they did? In fact, their preferences and their first preferences are actually moving far more wildly than they had, say, in the previous 2 decades.
In the Senate, there's a decline in major party support decade by decade, fairly steadily from the time the electoral systems changed in the 1940s. It accelerates much more recently. In 1998, of course, this was the first time that we'd had a breakout of a party since the Democrats, but before the Democrats we'd had the DLP. So incursions in either on the right or the left, or in the case of Democrats from the right but straight down the middle as they hoped, were not unprecedented in the post-war period. The nature, of course, of the One Nation breakout was quite different. That was something we hadn't seen either from the DLP, a voice for immigration, the NCC strongly anti-racist, and not from the Democrats. So what we saw around immigration and Aboriginal privilege, quote unquote, was a complete departure. Yeah.
Sure, I'm just wondering, there was a big debate about exchange of preferences between Liberals and Nationals by nation. What was the impact of the decision not to encase exchange of preferences?
Well, as you know, in 1998, the Liberal divisions all in the end decided to put One Nation last. And then the question arises, did this please, as it should have, those that were outraged by Hamsun? But what did it do to the Hamsun voters? And it's difficult to say that it had much impact. About, I don't know, something like 67-70% of Hamsun's vote came from people that had voted for the coalition in 1996, but their preferences only just favoured the coalition, 53-47. But those who had voted for Labor in 1996 and were voting for Hamsun this time in 1998 also split their preferences in roughly the same way. It's not clear to me that the preferencing had much impact.
Thank you. Gary Nairn.
Gary Nairn. So Member for Eden-Monaro, obviously in that election. One area that you didn't mention in talking about health and GST and other things is aged care. And an electorate that has a substantially higher demographic of older persons, I believe it was a key factor that actually worked against me in that election. Some may recall we had developed a very good aged care policy, but unfortunately the greater public didn't know that there was a problem in aged care. We gave them a solution for a problem they didn't know existed, and it worked against. So that was my first question. In your research, have you seen where the role of aged care in that election, what result? And that's really following on from Cheryl's comment about preference swap. The other aspect with One Nation, particularly in my electorate, I would have to say, there was a very strong infiltration of One Nation by recognised Labor people and shooters, and a flow on from the 97 decisions. Consequently, I got a much lower number of preferences from Nation than I would have normally expected, particularly given that One Nation produced a how to vote card on two sides, the coloured side preferencing Labor, the black and white side preferencing Liberal. So I'd like to just comment on those two issues.
Yes, I haven't seen detailed analyses of preference flows in terms of the kinds of cards that were distributed. The AES data, the Australian Election Study data, doesn't suggest that the guns issue advantaged One Nation vis-a-vis the coalition. The odds of voting One Nation rather than the coalition, if you're a gun owner in 1998, were roughly even. There was nothing much in it. As I mentioned, McAllister and Bean say that the over 55s didn't favour Labor much. Now, in terms of the issue of aged care, it's a weakness of the Australian Election Study that they don't list all the possible policies, and aged care is not one of the policies that are listed. There's a broader problem, of course, with the Australian Election Study, and that is terms that were part of the vernacular, like Howard's battlers. There's no way of cashing that out in terms of the survey instrument. This is done without regard to, current politics. The idea, Ian McAllister's idea, is to have a data set that, is sort of timeless. And so a lot of these questions that are specific to 1998 or over a couple of elections just don't get picked up.
Yeah. Forgive me for seeing this from a Labor point of view. Kim Beazley didn't believe he could win. In his heart of hearts, he had the most profound of doubts. John Howard was awake up to that, and he conveyed his doubts and overwhelmed Gary Gray. The national machine put in a very poor campaign. I don't think there's any speculation about that. So when you've got a man who was determined, having one office, to hold on to it, against a bloke who's riddled with doubts, it does have an impact on the whole atmospherics. Now, I happen to be with John and Tony Eggleton. For reasons I could take a long time to explain. I was in the chair, the MC, at the opening of the Museum of Australia, the turning of the first sod, to be more accurate. And John's body language told me one thing, which was he was expecting defeat. If you saw him at that time, I think you were read it the same way. The Rugby League Grand Finals were on in those blessed days. They were played at the Sydney Football Stadium. John was a guest of the NRL. Kim was a guest of the Sydney Cricket Ground Trust. I had a long conversation with Kim. It's now so long ago, I think these things can be talked about. He did not believe he could win. He just didn't believe it. That, it's often hard to look at an election from the point of view of the loser, but this is something that Nuffield studies have started to think about. You go in for long and detailed explanations about why the Attlee opposition won in 1945. You don't look at the state of the government. Well, I suggest that any understanding of John Howard's impressive victory in 98 needs to look at the state of the Labor Party. The second thing, very brief, if you look at the swing table, New South Wales held. Because New South Wales held, the Howard government was re-elected. The first, on the swing, all those seats up to 1% fell, and all those seats between 2 and 3 outside of New South Wales fell. I've never believed in the impact of the local member, and over the life of the government, when the swings were on in the states in question, because federal elections are still, for the most part, in 6 different polities, then the seats will fall or not fall.
No. This was an exception, Rod. That's the point of part of the point of the paper. Traditionally, the pendulum has been a very reliable guide in net terms, not looking at individual seats. The paradox of the pendulum as a campaign tool is that it encourages campaign managers to look at marginal seats, but the general argument of the pendulum is that whatever the national swing is, you can read off the net loss or gain for either side. And on the whole, that's been right. In 2016, it was spot on. In 2013, spot on. You don't need arguments about Mediscare, in my view, complete fabrications to explain what happened in 2016. In 1998, what you're faced with is an extraordinary anomaly. And the best explanation I can come up with is not about individual members, but a class of members, people on the coalition side, on the Liberal side, overwhelmingly, who are elected in 1996 in that big Howard win, who are hanging on by 1 or 2 percentage points by virtue of their being sitting members in a coalition government, which suggests something about pork barrelling or marginal seat polling. My suspicion is actually more pork barrelling than marginal seat polling, because marginal seat campaigning would indicate to you that the Liberals should have been able to have done the trick in 1996, in 2001, in 2004, in 2007. Most of those elections, they don't defy the pendulum. And if they're so much better as campaigners, what's happening in these other elections? I'm intrigued by the power of pork barrelling, on which there's been too little work. And the point about pork barrelling is it's an advantage potentially for a government not available to an opposition. And the sophomore advantage that Simon Jackman identified was an advantage which accrued to coalition members of the government, not to Labor members of the opposition.
With time, we only have time for one final question down the back there.
Hi, I was just wondering, what are some of the characteristics of the Liberal Party voters?
Characteristic Liberal Party voters?
Yeah, it's age group and just what were their backgrounds and things like that.
I can't recall offhand. I do have a paper on this that I can draw your attention to, published in the Australian Journal of Political Science, which looks at each of the elections from 1996 to 2004 or 2007, I forget which, and you can see the changes in the characteristics of the voters there. I'm interested here in the shifts of the votes rather than what are the predominant characteristics of the voters, notwithstanding the shifts.
We've started very well. I'm sure there's lots of conversation to be had during afternoon tea about what we've just heard. Would you please join with me in thanking Professor Murray Goot?